Hello and welcome to the Healthcare Today podcast. Our guest today is Ben Pumphrey, a legal director in the governance, funding and corporate team at national law firm Anthony Collins. As data and cybersecurity threats increase, a growing number of high-profile breaches have rocked the health and social care sector, creating significant real-world consequences for both patients and the providers. With threats escalating, cost pressures mounting and new technologies transforming care, today we'll be talking about how organizations can keep patient data safe and how we should balance innovation with the ironclad duty of confidentiality. In an article you wrote for Healthcare Today, you cited two major breaches: Advanced Computer Software Group in 2022 and Synovus in 2024. What do these two cases tell us about how the nature of cyber threats in health and social care is evolving?
That's a really poignant question, I think, at the moment in terms of the healthcare sector and what's going on in wider cyber world. I think if you look at the two breaches side by side, what you can see is a bit of a shift really from a sort of compliance data protection failure to more of a systemic patient safety threat. And I think both incidents highlight that attacks on supply chains can have a significant impact on the downstream providers of healthcare. But I think what the advanced breach reflected was it was symptomatic of the approach of hackers at that time, where it would be a pure ransomware attack. And perhaps the impacts on healthcare were perhaps more secondary or indirect, as opposed to it being a direct attack on the healthcare ecosystem. And I think the Synovus breach was intended to be a much more direct hit, if you like, on clinical care at scale, really. What it does highlight is that system attacks have become a healthcare ecosystem risk. So you've potentially got a single point of failure for healthcare rather than just solely a single organizational risk. The Stryker breach recently that happened last month, I think, also highlights, the key role that supply chain providers play within the medical field. When one of them goes down at scale, it knocks out healthcare organizations all over the place. So I think it's not only becoming a localized risk in terms of organizations in the UK, when you've got global supply chains going on and you've got large scale providers that supply systems globally to healthcare organizations, you've got an organization in the US or Australia or somewhere wherever that can knock out systems globally. And organizations in the UK find themselves caught up within that global network that hackers operate in.
The Information Commissioner's Office action against Advanced Computer Software Group was notable for being the first time it had fined a data processor rather than the data owner. What's the significance of this shift?
It was significant because I think since GDPR came in, I think there was an atmosphere of complacency around the fact that enforcement's just going to be against data controllers. It'll be data controllers that have to pick up the fines. Processors can stay in the dark a little bit in the background, and they won't need to worry about any kind of action from the ICO, notwithstanding the fact that the GDPR did say it is open to regulators to take action against processors when they haven't complied with their obligations under Article 28 of the GDPR. In relation to the advanced attack, the scale of the fine that the ICO levied against Advanced really did highlight to processors that they do need to comply with appropriate security measures. And, I think it highlighted that there were a number of gaps in their architecture that the ICO considered were actually quite basic level security considerations that they had not put in place. So they hadn't installed multi-factor authentication across all relevant systems. They weren't conducting regular vulnerability scanning. They hadn't got adequate patch management in place. And they hadn't got adequate level of vulnerability management controls, which met industry standards. So where we're talking about key players within the healthcare market, I think in that case, there was good reason for the ICO to levy the fine against the processor. Now, does that mean that the controllers got away with it in that case? Well, arguably, did they do enough due diligence on advance to make sure that they had adequate technical and organizational measures to protect patient data? Arguably they didn't. But I think what it did highlight two processes is that they are absolutely within the ballpark when it comes to regulatory action. And it's also a reminder to controllers that you need to undertake appropriate due diligence on your processes and make sure that they have got those measures in place, and not just take their data processing addendum at face value without actually checking those controls.
The Synovus attack, meanwhile, led to more than 11,000 cancelled appointments. In your conversations with providers, how has this changed the conversation around cybersecurity? Is it now seen less as an IT issue and more as a core patient safety and operational resilience issue?
I think that Synovus really demonstrated the shift that I mentioned earlier in terms of we've moved from a ransomware attack against a single organization with perhaps indirect effects against downstream organizations to an attack which was intended to disrupt clinical processes and patient safety, essentially. I think the fact that a patient death actually occurred as a result of the Synovus attack shows that there is a real concern that there is a paradigm shift here going on, in that organizations are deliberately focusing on healthcare to be disruptive and to target healthcare because they can see the level of disruption that it creates across multiple different organizations. So I think it's moved from just being a compliance risk in one corner to an active clinical health and safety risk and a governance issue that boards absolutely need to be aware of. I think the breaches against healthcare are becoming more targeted, they're becoming more systemic, they're becoming more harmful, and they're much harder to recover from. One of the things about this breach was that the data was really fragmented, and it's become very difficult for organizations to recover where you've got patients seeing clinicians across multiple organizations. They each hold their own data, and they can't piece together when there is a cyber attack. They can't piece together whose data belongs to whom. So I think it's becoming much more difficult for organizations to, where they are so immersed in with their suppliers, it's becoming much more difficult for organizations to recover because they're reliant on their suppliers to find out exactly what's happened and who's been affected.
You've highlighted the growing use of bring your own device schemes, which are driven by cost pressures but often lack a proper policy. With staff using WhatsApp and public Wi-Fi, is BYOD a risk that can be effectively managed?
That's a really good question. I think particularly since COVID and the rise in remote working, BYOD has become a real part of that landscape. And I think it's filtered across into the health and social care environment. And particularly when people are undertaking flexible working, they don't necessarily work in one particular location. You've got a lot of organizations using agency staff in many different settings. I think there's been a real temptation to use BYOD, but perhaps turn a bit of a blind eye to the data protection and cybersecurity risks that are associated with it. The one thing I mentioned in the article was that the Digital Care Hub had run a survey in 2025, and only half of those organizations using BYOD who were surveyed by the Digital Care Hub had security measures in place or security policies in place to protect personal data that was held on personal devices. My personal view is that within the health and social care sector particularly, it's very difficult to manage the level of risk that you're carrying using a BYOD process because there's so many data protection risks that go along with BYOD. You know, you don't have control over the phone. You don't have control over whether the device has been kept up to date and patched. You don't have control when somebody changes their device, which, you know, we all do relatively frequently. The only real controls that you have, unless you've got a staff cohort that are willing to have mobile device management actually installed on their own personal phone, which is highly unlikely because it means you can centrally wipe their device. Essentially, what you're left with are organizational controls. So in effect, you're reliant on your staff not to use WhatsApp to share images or clinical data. You haven't got a technical bar to be able to prevent that from happening. So I think unless you are able to use MDM to wipe devices or have direct control over a device, the fact that you're simply reliant on organizational measures does create a significant level of risk around data, which is, let's face it, highly sensitive, both in health and or social care.
So with that in mind, what does a good BYOD policy actually look like in practice?
You really need to look at your own risk appetite as an organization and start with the question, is it really necessary for you to have BYOD? Or is it, let's face it, is it essentially financial considerations that are leaving you open to actively using BYOD across your staff cohort? So I think, having considered your risk appetite, you will need to ensure that you have a very robust and detailed policy about what staff can and can't do on a personal device. You need to be clear about what technical minimum standards those devices need to have. They need to have up-to-date operating systems. They need to have strong passwords. They absolutely need to have multi-factor authentication before they can access your networks. And I think you've really got to repeat the messaging around how they can use their own device securely when it comes to holding corporate information, or more than that, patient information. So I think you've got to have ongoing training and ongoing user education about why the rules matter and why it's absolutely critical to ensure that that personal data is protected when it's sitting on their own device and you haven't got access to the device when they're not working during their working hours. So I think, yes, it may be possible to have a BYOD policy and approach within your organization, but the risks are high and they should be considered very carefully before you go down that road.
You've talked about the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, DSPT, we love an acronym, as a key standard, especially for NHS and ICB commissioned services. Is the DSPT a sufficient benchmark for security, or is it more of a baseline tick box exercise?
I think that's a really good question. We used to have in the NHS, I say we, because I used to be a DPO in the NHS as well, there used to be the Information Governance Toolkit, which I think was very data protection focused, but it didn't apply the level of scrutiny that DSPT now does. And DSPT is now seeking to align itself with the NCSC, National Cybersecurity Centre's cyber assessment framework. So I think even since DSPT came in back in 2017, I think even since then there's been a step change in how DSPT operates, and they're much more aware of baselining risk appropriately and ensuring that organizations do have a baseline level of risk, a baseline level of assurance, around cybersecurity protections. Obviously, within health and social care, that's really crucial. I think what I would say is the approach of the DSPT is one which largely asks, do you have X? Is Y documented? Or can you evidence that something exists? Rather than actually testing out your cybersecurity protection apparatus in the real world. So it doesn't really ask, does this control actually withstand an attack? It doesn't ask, have you tested it recently and independently? It doesn't ask if staff could execute this plan at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. So whilst it tries to evidence what measures you've got in place, it can't claim to be able to have tested those measures in the real world. And I think, where you've got DSPT as your baseline, I think the biggest leap beyond that is a cultural one, where you've got more mature organizations that are able to equate cyber risk to a patient safety risk. I think you've got the involvement of clinical leadership within cyber resilience planning so that they're aware of cyber risk amounting to a clinical risk and therefore having sort of parity of esteem of those risks rather than it just being a compliance exercise, which I think DSPT is still very much thought of. And I think if DSPT is a step change towards a more practical level of, were the worst to happen, do we have sufficient contingency in place that we can ensure we can still operate as an organization, then I think it's absolutely a step in the right direction. If it still stays in the box of, have we got this piece of paper and have we got that piece of paper so we can pretend that we're compliant, then it hasn't delivered the cultural change around cyber that it really needs to have done.
Turning to data protection impact assessments, many people might see a DPIA as a burdensome piece of paperwork. How can a well-executed DPIA be a strategic tool for innovation and risk management rather than just a compliance hurdle?
Yes, I have had direct experience of this so many times, Glenn, particularly when I was a DPO within healthcare, that you get IT or a clinical team going off on a frolic and wanting to put in place this, that, and the other. And then at the last minute, somebody thinks, oh, hang on, have data protection signed this off? And they come running in through your door, slap it in front of your desk and go, Ben, can you quickly sign that off, please? Because we just can't get it over the line otherwise. And then I start to ask questions and say things like, hang on a minute, and you start to see the temperature rise and people start to get a little bit flustered. That tends to suggest that data protection with your organization is not really culturally embedded and is very much an afterthought. And I think, when you're at that point, all that a DPIA ends up doing is creating friction and delay and ends up with me just going, the DPO says no. If you're in that space, there's no point in having a DPIA because it's not delivering the exercise that it is intended to deliver, where I think it's intended to enable all of the project teams that are involved in the process to be able to systematically analyze, identify and minimize those data protection risks, and to demonstrate that your proposed project or new device or whatever it is not only compliant with data protection obligations, but actually is delivering what you want to deliver in the right way, but also in a safe way and in a way that delivers confidence to the patients at the end of the day, but you're protecting their data appropriately. So I think the purpose of a DPIA is not to stop progress, but I think it's to set the right conditions for safe progress as to how you are implementing whatever it is you want to do. So I think one of the real benefits of the DPIA process is that it does provide a legitimate pause in being able to say, hang on a minute, is this the right way to do it? Do you understand the legal basis for what you're doing? And have you properly assessed how the system works and ensuring it's using personal data in the way that it's intended, rather than to just have the unknown unknowns in the background where suddenly you go, oh, did it work like that? And suddenly someone else has got your data or it's been sent into a different country or wherever. So I think it helps you ask the right questions up front to not only stay compliant, but ensure that you're delivering data security and data protection in a way that's absolutely going to protect patients and ensure that you are appropriately managing their rights and freedoms.
Now, AI promises huge efficiencies but introduces new risks. You have rightly warned against AI systems that are merely rubber stamped by clinicians. In practice, how do you ensure that meaningful human oversight is real and not just a theoretical safeguard, especially in high-pressure environments like the NHS or under-resourced social care settings?
One of the clear risks with AI at the moment is basically where you're in a scenario of the AI is essentially, to all intents and purposes, is taking the decision, and the human is just coming along and rubber stamping a decision that the AI purportedly calls a recommendation. But in effect, if you're not owning the decision as the human in the loop, effectively AI has taken that decision already. So if you're not being clear about how the AI works and at what point the human steps in, takes that recommendation, but applies their own logic and consideration and thought to it and gives due weight to the recommendation, but doesn't allow that recommendation to become the decision, then I think you are ensuring that the AI is not taking an autonomous decision and that there is a clear human rationale for why you've taken the decision that you have. So I think, for there to be real oversight, the human reviewer has to have both the authority and the time to question, override, or if necessary, to reject the AI output or recommendation that you've got. So an identifiable individual needs to remain responsible for the decision, and clinicians need to be prepared to be challenged on if they went with the recommendation that's been made by the AI, that they can justify why they did so. And I think record keeping around that is going to be really key, because we'll need to see that there clearly has been an explicit human decision that has either accepted or rejected what the AI says, and the reasons for either of those. So the ICO is insistent, really, that when it comes to high-risk AI systems, that there is clear evidence, there is a clear audit trail that a human has had meaningful involvement in that clinical decision-making process.
Many AI tools are bought off the shelf from suppliers who themselves use third-party models. What are the critical questions a health or social care provider should ask an AI vendor before signing a contract, specifically regarding data security?
I think when it comes to any high-risk processing of data, a DPIA is mandatory. And I think DPIAs do need to be reviewed in terms of the questions that they are posing to be able to understand the right kind of questions to ask about AI. And do you know how to be able to determine the benefits and risks of deploying that AI technology? Who needs to be consulted? And how you are able to review the quality and reliability of those AI systems. So I think the step change with AI is to be able to ensure that your DPIA is appropriately able to interrogate that system and enable you to understand the input data that the AI system used, how it was trained. Are you sure that it doesn't have any hidden bias in the system and doesn't discriminate against any groups? And are you sure that the outputs are accurate based on that training data as well? So I think there's a cohort of questions that you need to be very clear about, ensuring that your processor who's providing the AI system, you need to be very clear that that processor is able to answer those questions. I think it's crucial that you do have good due diligence questionnaires available to you that are able to appropriately interrogate what you're being told by the third party provider. Because in my experience, a lot of those third party providers are just trying to sell you a product and tend to pay a little bit of lip service to the data protection aspects of their systems. Whereas you need that assurance that if you are using a high-risk AI system, that all of the due diligence has been appropriately done, the system has been appropriately trained, that you know what data it's used, that you know if any other sub-processors are involved as well. If they can't provide you with this information, they are not going to give you meaningful control over the data that you're giving them.
Now, to wrap up, how do you make the business case for robust data security and governance when leaders are facing the impossible choices about frontline care spending? How do you convince a board that investing in a data protection impact assessment or a security tool is as critical as investing in, say, a new MRI machine or hiring more staff?
Yeah, I think if there's any upside to breaches like Advanced or Synovis or even the recent Striker breach, I think it's the fact that we have moved from a compliance risk to a systemic clinical risk within our healthcare systems. I think if you've got cyber causing a direct clinical risk for patients, as the Synovis breach highlighted in one particular case, because a patient died, you've got a governance risk for your organization there. And that needs to be on your board assurance framework in the same way you would assess other clinical risks on that framework. And that's going to require investment in your data protection teams. That's going to require perhaps a cultural shift in the way that you approach data protection. It's not just an ICO compliance risk. It's a systemic healthcare risk. And I think, without those sorts of solid risk management frameworks in place, I think healthcare providers really need to be aware that this is a when, not if risk in terms of a cyber attack. So I think the investment in cyber very much ought to be a priority for boards, because I think the attack vectors that we're seeing within cyberspace just keep on increasing. So you do need to apply the investment and make sure you've got appropriate security system management, make sure you've got appropriate patching, make sure you've got appropriate vulnerability scanning all across your network, and not just 9 to 5, because the hackers don't operate 9 to 5, they operate at all times of the day. I would be looking at appointing a CISO, making sure you've got a CISO on your board, or at least somebody with board level responsibility for information security risk.
Ben Pumphrey, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be with you, Glenn. Thanks for the invite.